Right, hello everyone. Today we're looking at the role of women in Nazi Germany, and we're going to be analyzing the Nazis' policies and how these policies changed the role of women after the year 1933. Before we get underway today, we're going to pull back on the knowledge that we have from our study of our America unit. And we're going to be looking at the changing role of women from the First World War. So we're going to go kind of 1917 all the way to the 1990s in America. And to get us started off on looking at the changes, we do have a picture of a woman here in a war factory in 1917, and we've got a woman at work in the 1990s. So looking at the changes of the role of women in the USA, we're going to go back to 1898, and we're going to start off by looking at the domestic responsibility of women in working in the home. And if we do look at 1898, the 1920s and 30s, even the 50s and 60s, we can see this role of women as being domestic servants, working in the home. Even though they're outside the home, they still have the job of being wives and mums. Now, the changes we see in 1917 and 1940 are brought on by conflict. With men away at war, there was no choice but to have women fill these jobs in the war factories. And this leads them into this non traditional responsibility of working outside the home, taking on new kinds of work. But after the war is over, we can see they tend to return back to this period of domestic work. Now, the 1970s was quite different because this was a rejection of traditional roles, and this was the women's movement. We've talked about author Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. It was all about women kind of challenging those traditional gender roles. And after the 1970s, with this protest of traditional gender roles, we then saw again women returning into the workplace in stronger numbers. Now, this isn't to say that women in the 1950s and 60s didn't work. Some did, and some decided to keep their jobs after the Second World War. But the vast majority bowed to social pressure and returned back to the home. So, our key terms looking at marriage loans, divorce laws, Lebensborn, and the three Ks. So, marriage loans we'll get into a little bit later. Divorce laws are just that laws about who can divorce and when. Lebensborn was a breeding program set up by the Nazis, and the three Ks stands for Kinder, Kusch, and Kirche, which are the German words for children, kitchen, and church. Again, something we'll go into detail in a few moments. So, looking at gender roles in Germany, uh, the role of women changed a lot once the Nazis took control in 1933. In the past, politicians would really only target men because they were seen as the voter in the household. And typically, whoever the husband would vote for, his wife or girlfriend would vote for the same person just out of principle rather than out of choice. The Nazis realized quite early on that if they needed to be successful, they had to get the vote from every German, not just men. In the 1920s, women in Germany started to experience a bit more political and social freedom, and many of them became more informed of politics and were willing to make their own choices rather than just doing what their husband was saying. So Hitler saw women as being a very useful asset to his regime. Women needed to be utilized for their voting power and mobilized to assist in the growth of the country. Now, if we go up here, we can see the way that Nazis viewed both genders. So we have men and we've got women. Now, both of them, well, you need both to procreate. Both of them are voters, and Hitler realized by 1937 that they can both actually contribute to the military. Now, men would be soldiers, but women could work in different roles in war factories. Men could do the manual labor, they'd be fathers, they'd be the protectors of Germany, while women would be the mums, they'd be the nurses, and they would be the housewives. So, looking at before and after, we've already alluded to the 1920s and after 1933, and we can do so by looking at the images of a German woman. This is from the mid 1920s, and we have a propaganda poster from 1933. In the 1920s, women wore makeup, they wore shorter skirts, they even wore trousers, high heels, they would smoke cigarettes, they'd work outside the home, and they would share their household duties with others, specifically their husband, believe it or not. After the Nazis took power in 1933, they made a lot of changes. Now, none of this was law. You didn't have to do it, but social pressure would encourage women to follow these rules. So makeup wasn't allowed. Women would wear kind of long, loose-fitting clothes, and we can see that in the image below. Only wearing flat shoes, they couldn't smoke. This was for health reasons. The Nazis did suspect that smoking cigarettes while pregnant could lead to birth defects, which was true. Jobs outside the home were taken away from women and they were given to men. Again, that would raise the employment rate. And we have talked about invisible unemployment. So this is when the Nazis would take jobs away from women and Jews. They would give them to German men because all women were already seen as fully employed as housewives and mums. Now, there's this whole talk about kind of a peasant lifestyle. And this is just that kind of simple lifestyle where women have the role of serving the house and serving the country rather than kind of serving themselves. So we're going to look at the different policies the Nazis had and aimed towards women, and we're going to try to assess their success rate, whether or not they were successful in achieving their aims or if they failed. So the first is our marriage laws. This is the 1935 Law for the Encouragement of Marriage. It kind of does what it says. It was a law that was designed to encourage newlywed couples to have loads of kids. And when you were married, you could take 1,000 mark loan from the government, which was a substantial amount of money in those days. It was enough for a down payment on a house to buy a new car. But you were only eligible for this if the woman left her job. And again, this was part of that invisible unemployment scheme to kind of free up different jobs for men. Now, this is where it gets interesting. For every child that you had, you could keep 250 marks. So that would mean that if you had 3 kids, you would have a total of 750 marks in your pocket and have to pay back 250. But if you had 4 kids, then you could keep all the money. And the average family size grew from 1 child per household to 3 children under this scheme. So we're going to keep that in mind when we're discussing its validity and success. The next is divorce laws, and the Nazis changed divorce laws in 1938. Originally, there were some men who were seeking divorces because they were unable to conceive children, and the Nazis viewed any childless marriage as a useless one. They viewed the sole purpose of marriage was to procreate. Now, it didn't matter who was actually infertile in that relationship. Most oftentimes, it was seen as the woman's fault that she couldn't bear a child, and the man was able to divorce and move on to find a new partner. Creepily, the law also said that if a man already had 4 kids, he could divorce his wife to start a new family. And this was in the sole purpose of just trying to increase the amount of children being born in Germany. Ever since kind of the First World War, the birth rate in Germany was on the decline. They were having more people die every year than people were being born, so their population was slowly decreasing. The Nazis knew at some point they're going to wage war, they're going to start a conflict. They need to have a strong population, both soldiers on the front line and civilians supporting the fight from home, whether it's in war factories or working in any kind of war industry. Lebensborn, this translates into life springs, and this was a breeding program set up by the Nazis where they would take unmarried women, and the women always were unmarried, and they were paired up with an SS man to essentially donate a baby to Hitler. Now, throughout the Lebensborn program, about 8,000 babies were born. 4,000 of the babies didn't actually ever know who their father was. About half of them did. They either had some kind of contact, whether they stayed in touch or were actually raised by that father, or some of them were just kind of put in touch through kind of orphanages and other means to keep in touch with who their dad was. Most of the babies were actually immediately given up by the mother and raised in a Lebensborn orphanage. Now, there were lots of these in Germany, and there were also a few of them in Norway as well. A lot of women who were part of the Lebensborn program did just that. They would carry the baby for 9 months. When the baby was born, they would just give it away for adoption, and they would have another baby. And a lot of people kind of wonder, why would a woman do this and put herself through that? we do need to remember the role of women. And if we go back to our Venn diagram we saw earlier, we know that women didn't have the opportunity to be a soldier. So this was the main way that they could contribute to the German war effort, was by giving birth to babies who could then become soldiers, or if they were girls, give birth to soldiers later in life. The three Ks, this is Kinder, Kusch and Kirche. So that means kids, kitchen, and church. So a woman's job was to have children and raise them with Nazi values. A woman should work in the home and prepare healthy meals for the husband and children, and that's so they can be strong soldiers. And women should go to the Reich Church. And this was set up in 1933. Originally, Hitler didn't have any issues with the Catholic Church. He actually met with the Pope and said, "You do your thing, Pope, I'll do my thing, and we won't interfere with each other." And then Hitler started to interfere with the church to a point that he actually banned the Catholic Church in Germany and set up the new Reich Church. The Holy Bible was actually replaced with a copy of Mein Kampf, and the cross, you could probably guess, was replaced with a swastika. In 1937, the Nazis had to reverse this policy. This was one of the few times where the Nazis actually went back on their word and changed laws that they had already made. They discovered by 1937 there were too many men who were joining the military, and this left a lot of factory jobs open. The Nazis knew to continue to grow their military, they had to make sure all men were serving in the armed forces and all women were starting to serve in the war industry, specifically in war factories. Now, propaganda is another. We're going to talk about Frau Muller. So, Frau Muller, she's fictitious. She's not actually real. Frau Muller is here. So, she's the one who looks very tired after giving birth to 12 children. This was actually anti-Nazi propaganda from Czechoslovakia in 1935, and we know it's propaganda against the Nazis because of the way that Frau Muller is depicted. Again, all of her children, they look so happy to be Nazis. Everyone in the audience is so thrilled to see Frau Muller, but she just looks absolutely exhausted. We can even see her ribs exposed because, again, she's just so worn out from having all these children. However, the message and desire for Nazi women to have very large families is actually quite true. What women would actually have, and men as well, when they were married, is they were given a ancestral passport. Now, inside this passport, there were 12 blank spaces, and this was a kind of a hint for families. You can have lots of kids. So every time you have a child, you will write their name down in this ancestral passport, and it will keep track of your children's, their purity. Are they Aryan or are they not? And it will serve as kind of further evidence for the Nazi government as to how pure the German public is. This can also be seen in Joseph Goebbels. So he is the German Minister of Propaganda. Hopefully at this point we're familiar with him. This photo was taken in 1942. So we can see that many of these children here were born in the mid to late 1930s. And this is when Hitler was really pushing for Germans to have large families.
In one sense, the view that women should stay at home and look after the children didn't change with the Nazis coming to power. Even in the Weimar Republic, where women could vote and be elected to government, many people still believed that a woman's place was at home. When the Nazis came to power, Hitler made these ideas a reality for all women. In a speech talking about the part women should play in Germany in 1934, Hitler said that women have one single point, and that is the child. While man makes his supreme sacrifice on the field of battle, woman fights her supreme battle for her nation when she gives life to a child. Man's world is the state. The world of woman is a smaller world. For her world is a husband, her family, her children, and her home. In 1921, women were banned from holding important jobs within the Nazi Party, and in 1933, Hitler banned women from professional jobs such as doctors, lawyers, and civil servants. They now had to concentrate on the three Ks: Kinder, Kirche, and Küche, meaning children, church, and kitchen. This was a win-win situation for the Nazis. With women not allowed to work, The jobs could be given to the men, and women would be able to have more children who would grow up to be supporters of the Nazis. Propaganda posters were used to convince women to behave as model German women, and also medals were awarded. If you had 8 children, you were given a gold Mother Cross, a silver medal for 6 children, and a bronze medal for 4. The German Maidens' League reinforced these ideas, and the birth rate did increase. The Nazis encouraged women to marry, and they received a loan of 1,000 marks, about half a year's pay for this, and the more children they produced, the less they paid back. The Christian Church was a different problem for the Nazis. Like their views on women, most Germans had a view on church. Most Germans went to church, roughly 1/3 being Catholic and 2/3 Protestant. Like most things linked with Germany, the Nazis wanted one religion and one church that was neither Catholic nor Protestant, but a German church. The reason behind this was simple. The church offered people a different way of life to Nazi ideas, and one church would make them easier to control. Church leaders were happy to support the Nazis to begin with, partly because they were seen as upholders of traditional family values, and because the Nazis were against a group that would close the churches if they ever came to power, the Communists. One priest who supported the Nazis in 1933 was Martin Niemöller. He voted for Hitler and even spoke in his own church about the good the Nazis would bring, especially getting rid of the Jewish influence in Germany. However, he ended up in a Nazi concentration camp a few years later for criticizing the Nazis. How was this possible? The Nazis knew that to get rid of the church was almost impossible. The next best thing was to have some control or to coordinate it, and this was what led to Niemöller's time in the camp. In 1933, the Nazis and the Catholic Church signed an agreement called the Concordat. The Catholic Church agreed that it would not say anything about Nazi policies if the Nazis didn't interfere with religion. As with most promises Hitler made, it didn't take very long for him to break it. Catholic youth groups were closed down because they were a rival to the Hitler Youth. The Catholic Church tried to improve the situation, but by 1937 the leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope, said that Nazi ideas were against Christianity, and in 1941 a letter from the Pope criticizing the Nazis for their abuse of human rights was read out in churches across Germany. The response was simple. Nuns and priests were sent to the concentration camps. It was the attempt to control or coordinate the church that led to Martin Niemöller being put into a concentration camp. As mentioned before, he had supported the Nazis and their hatred for the Jews. His attitude started to change once the Nazis gradually took more control of the Protestant church and tried to set up the Reich Church in 1936, which removed crosses and Bibles and replaced them with a sword and Hitler's Mein Kampf. Niemöller and other priests like Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't agree with this, and they criticized the Nazis. It should come as no surprise that Niemöller was arrested and beaten during his time in the concentration camp. Bonhoeffer was also arrested, but unlike Niemöller, he was killed by hanging in a concentration camp. Niemöller survived, and after he was released, he said of the time when he had supported the Nazis, "First they took the communists, but I was not a communist, so I said nothing. Then they took the Social Democrats, but I was not a Social Democrat, so I did nothing. Then it was the trade unionists' turn, but I was not a trade unionist. And then they took the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did little. Then when they came for me, there was no one left who could have stood up for me."
So how successful were these Nazi policies? Well, marriage laws, so we know the law for the encouragement of marriage gave a 1,000-mark loan. It took women out of employment, gave the jobs to men, and the average family size grew from about 1 to 3 children. Divorce laws, men could leave a relationship if no children were had. Many couples actually stayed together through the uncertainty of the Great Depression and war. 8,000 babies were born under the Lebensborn program, but none of them were actually old enough to fight in the Second World War, which was kind of Hitler's intention. The 3Ks, he set out the ideals for Nazi women, kids, kitchen, and church, and uses of propaganda, so encouraged Germans to fall into their assigned and designated roles for the betterment of the nation. Most people would argue that marriage laws were quite successful. We can see that family size did actually grow. under the marriage laws. And it was a pretty good incentive for you to have lots of kids because you did get that 1,000 mark loan. Divorce laws weren't really seen as all that successful, and many historians would say that a lot of couples chose to stay together rather than getting divorced, and they just might try more often to have a child rather than simply ending their relationship to move on to new partners. The Lebensborn program, 8,000 babies were born. It is a lot, but the fact that none of them were ever old enough to fight in the Second World War just proves that that program didn't achieve the aim that it was set out to. The 3Ks were quite successful. A lot of women did give up their jobs willingly or not, and they returned to that domestic role as a housewife and mum. And propaganda was really effective. It was something the Nazis were really good at using. We've talked about the term Gleichschaltung, which is Nazification, meaning the Nazis appeared to be everywhere. They appeared to have total control of your lives. So instead of fighting against them, you might as well go with them. And a lot of women did fall into their assigned role in society simply because the Nazi propaganda was so effective. All right, so now it's time for our bonus facts. Uh, First fact is the Goebbels family photo that we looked at earlier. It's actually a fake. It's not real. So if we just kind of zoom in here, this is the oldest son. I think his name is Herman. He was actually away on military exercise at the time. And if you do look under the arms here of two of the daughters, you can actually see the background is a different color. And if we do look at the tops of their heads, again, you can see that it's quite cleanly cut around the top of the heads, much less so around the people who were actually there at the time the photo was taken. So he was just photoshopped in afterwards. They kind of cut his picture out and they just stuck it in behind the rest of the family. And this was just the way the Nazis were trying to show the general public, you know what? Ultimately, Joseph Goebbels has a big family, and so should you. Many Lebensborn fathers were already married. Uh, this is kind of a lesser known fact about the Lebensborn program, but many SS officers who were already married and had families of their own took it upon themselves, under instruction from Heinrich Himmler, to spread their seed, as you will. And in doing so, they would go off at night, oftentimes not telling their wives where they were going, and they would meet up with women selected for the Lebensborn program and impregnate them. So some men had, 3 or 4 legitimate children at home, and they might have had 5 or 6 or even more children in the Lebensborn program. And the last one, men weren't the only Nazis getting medals. This award was called the Cross of Honor of the German Mother, and women would be entitled to this award if they gave birth to a minimum of 4 children. Again, kind of going back to that law for the encouragement of marriage, with the incentive, with that 1,000 mark loan, to have at least 4 kids. So you would get a bronze award if you had 4 to 5 children. You would get a silver award if you had 6 or 7. And if you were like the fictitious Frau Muller and you had 8 or more children, you would get a gold uh, cross from the German government. You could wear this quite proudly so everyone would know that you're contributing to the German war effort. Right, so that concludes our lesson today. There is going to be a short quiz on Show My Homework, so please make sure you check that out, and we'll see you next time.